Hi everybody. Today we're going to go over how to start a Git project on GitHub and then how to commit, push those changes back up to GitHub, and hopefully get a pull request accepted. We'll go over all these terms. I know they don't make sense right now, but we'll go step by step and you'll be able to see how these play out on a developer's development. Okay, that was a joke. I'll go into log into GitHub. If you haven't created a profile, you really should. Create your Git history, and it's kind of like a scratch board for all your code projects that you are willing to share. Now, if you pay extra, this is free, but if you want to pay extra, you can have private Git repositories and even have access to create teams for small projects or group projects and go crazy. Now, let's start a project. On GitHub, this is the first one. Your projects will be under your username. So if I wanted to create Git Basics, this is a repository name. It'll check if I have other repositories with the same name since it will be part of a URL. So it makes that quick check. Makes it green because I don't have anything else for it. Use this to learn how to use Git. I'll make it public and I'll initialize this repository with a Readme. A Readme is the kind of the letterhead or the project title that comes up when you access somebody's repository. Let me show you what that looks like. So if I were to go and look for Google's TensorFlow project, we can stars and it's on TensorFlow. There it is. So TensorFlow, this is Google projects, and even though they don't say it in the name, and they are actually Google's project. This README is the file that's on the root directory of the repository and will show, based on markup language, all the documentation you want people to find out when they reach your Git projects or Git repository projects main page. So in our case, we're going to be under Professor Jime's Git Basics, and we'll add a README there. We'll make some changes to that, and I'll show you how. You can also do a git ignore file. That'll be a topic for another video, and add a license to this project. Now, there's a lot of license types, but I usually like to think of myself as an open source developer that wants to share. So by adding a GNU, you are allowing, and this is what I understand from the license, you're allowing anybody to use this source code in whatever way they please. Since we're not going to do anything super secret in this, nor anything that my company or our company depends on, we can just make sure that this can be shared and reused, modified by anybody else. So I'll create this repository, and it will create under my profile a new repository called Git Basics, which has a README that only has the title and description of the project. As you can see here, there's an initial commit. This happens from the GitHub side, where this is committed or this repository has been initialized, and these two files have been committed into that Git project. Now, for Git, and let's go over to that documentation once more. Git has a few, actually a lot of commands you could use. And one of the more important ones is the Git Clone Command. The Git Clone allows you to pull down a repository from an address, URL, or directory, and then drops it into the current directory you're in. We're going to use the command line. There's people that use Git interfaces like Atlassian source tree is a very popular GUI for Mac and Windows. It allows you to make the same or do the same commands, but on a interface, like a GUI interface. I tend to shy away from these because there's so many, and they are always using the actual Git program in the background. So this GUI interface is just a button that actually performs the same commands that you could write directly into your terminal. But some of the Git GUIs, like source tree, may not have all the Git commands that you could be able to or have access to from the command line. So that's kind of limiting. That's why I tell people I use the command line, but you're welcome to use source tree or any other Git GUI if you're comfortable with that. It also provides things like that really pretty graph that shows you your projects and your branch scheming. But that's not really needed once you kind of get into the flow. So for these videos, and the majority of them, I'm going to use the command line. So I think sooner or later you're going to have to get comfortable to some degree using the command line. Let's open up terminal and go into, actually, let's create a new one. So if this is the root directory in my computer, I'll actually create a new using mkdir. mkdir. And this stands for make directory. I'll create a directory name called code. And now we have code as one of those main folders when you actually log on from root in this user. Inside code, we will create a new directory called repos, which is a shortcut for repositories. And within repositories is where we will actually git clone, and we will be able to clone it using the address GitHub has provided us, which is now GitHub username and then repositories title. So if I git clone that, I will be pulling in all the source files, which at the moment are the license and the readme, into this folder. Like, let's navigate to that. Go into the code directory, repos, and now I have a new folder, which I didn't create, but using git clone, it pulls it down and creates it for me, called Git Basics. And Git Basics has two files in there, which is the license. If we were to open up and see what that's like, it's a bunch of legalese explaining the responsibilities for anybody that uses this code. And the README, which is our version of documentation in Git repositories. And that just has Git Basics, the title of the repository, and the description. Now, there's a Git Flow for how you pull down, add changes, commit those changes, and send them up. And I'll show you how that's usually done. Git version control. And there is a really good these are what you can think of as the 4 states of a Git repository. We have the remote repository, which in our version is the GitHub's Git Basics repository. And we've just performed one of those actions associated with that, which is the Git Clone. This allows us to pull down all that code into our workspace, which is our desktop or our computer. And we'll be making modifications to that, saving those modifications, then staging those modifications, committing those modifications, and then pushing those modifications back up to that repository. And I know those sounds like a lot of steps. They somewhat are. A lot of developers get confused on them, but once you get into the rhythm of how these states are different from one another, you'll be able to easily see how to get things back up. Now, a few of the more important commands are the Git Commit, which actually creates those snapshots, the Git Push and Git Pull commands, which actually bring down and up the code into the remote repository. And these other are not filler commands, but less used commands. Git Fetch enables you to do pull down the code, but don't override my current code. Git Reset will allow you to go back to a certain save point, Git Commit specifically, and then start from there instead of where you are at. And Git Reset will actually destroy all the current modifications you had on your work at the moment. Now, there's a key differences between these states. Workspace is the modifications you have on your computer right now. But those modifications may not necessarily be ready nor have been selected or identified by Git that you're intending to get these changes up into a remote repository through a commit. Once you've staged these changes, they are eligible to be committed into your local repository and then eventually pushed into your remote repository. Now, these may not make sense right now, but I'll come back to these steps over and over throughout our flow so you can identify what we're actually doing. Okay. Now, one of the things about these Readme files is they are a special file types. They're not necessarily just text files. Because if you look at, and I'll be using WebStorm to show you how that code works. Okay, WebStorm's opening up. I will access the local Git repository on my computer and show you all the source. This, I don't know where this is from. I'll delete that. And open a project. I will go to this Git Basics repository, open that up, and we'll see the project. Here's the main folder. It just has a license, that we just saw was just legalese, and this Readme, which uses only those 2 lines. With these, we'll make some modifications and you'll be able to see what happens in the flow. Now, I'll be going back to the command line to show you each of these steps. I'll go into Git Basics. And we're now at the root directory of that project. Great. One of the more commonly used Git commands on the command line that you wouldn't necessarily use on the Git GUIs is the Git Status. Because without that, we don't know what's actually going on. Here, you see your first peek at what's happening with our repository. This .idea/, and you're wondering, what does that even mean? Okay, there's a couple important parts. It's untracked, which means we've just made modifications to it locally, but they're not ready or staged, and we can't commit them, and much less push them up to the repository. Secondly, this is a configuration file that starts up when this WebStorm opens it up. It's kind of annoying, but it gives us a lot of benefits, which we're not going to go into right now. And what we want to do is, at the moment, just ignore this. And Git provides a really good way to actually ignore things. Now, if you remember when we created the repository, it prompted us or gave us the option to create a git ignore file. We're going to create that ourselves now. So in Git Basics, we only had license and Readme. Now we will actually touch a new file. Touch allows us to, in the command line, to create a new file with whatever name we give it. And I will give it .git ignore. It has to be in this format for Git to actually recognize that file and use it as the list of files or directories we are going to ignore in this Git repository. So, going back, if I open this, use the li command, we'll now see that there are hidden files and hidden directories within our root directory for the repository. .git is an important one. This is the folder that has all the metadata information for this repository. It's where Git keeps previous versions of the code base you're on, as well as commit information, metadata, and repository metadata. Git ignore is a file we just created, which will be the list that we'll be using in a moment. And the .idea is a directory, again, based on WebStorm that has configuration information. We don't want to delete it, but we're not going to use this for our code, and we're certainly not going to throw this up into our commits. So we'll ignore it for now. No. And as you can see, if you notice, it's also in red, which WebStorm is really good at identifying the state of what you're looking at and giving you more information. It knows that this is a Git repository and that git ignore hasn't been added, or as the code called it, it's untracked. Perfect. We'll actually open up that file and we will add the idea directory. Now, this has been added to the git ignore file. The repository itself doesn't know that we want to add the git ignore into our repository just yet. So I'll save this and clear this, and I'll perform the Git Status again, which will give me a status of what's going on in my repository at the moment. Okay, now it no longer lists the .idea subfolder, but now adds or has identified the git ignore as an untracked file. Perfect. These are just the things I wanted to show. Git is really smart about knowing what you're about to do and tries to help you. So it's now ignoring, even though I haven't committed the git ignore file. It's now ignoring the idea folder. This is great. Second part, we're actually going to make a modification to Readme. So this is how the Readme is online. That's the repository. If we wanted to see this as raw code, that's exactly what we're seeing. The hashtag, title, and then description. Now, if you've noticed, this doesn't have a hashtag, but instead has this highlighted. That's because the MD file, an MD file is a markup language file. You can add special characters to do special syntax and formatting and styling to the text that's on the page. And that's also how the TensorFlow Git repository had images and links and charts, and you pretty much can add a lot of stuff. So I'll make this. I'll add more information here. I'll do dash, which is a special symbol, which will add a list. And we'll say git commands, or explain git commands. We'll also identify the .git ignore file. And I'll save this. Now, if I show you on WebStorm, we have an untracked file, and the README that was white turned into blue, meaning that there's a modification that's happened that hasn't been saved yet. So I'll go back to the command line, and we'll do Git Status one more time. This will show you two things: changes that are not staged for commit, which the README was already tracked by the repository before I even cloned it. It was committed in by GitHub. So now it identifies that a tracked file has been modified. That's good. I don't have to actually change that then. Now, and the untracked file is still git ignore, which means even if I were to commit at this moment, we wouldn't be pushing in the changes of the git ignore file into our local repository. So here's a new command: git add, and then the file name, which is git ignore. And if you noticed, I just hit tab and it auto-completed. When you're doing file names in the command line, you can actually just hit tab, and if you're far along the full name of it, it will actually just be able to auto-complete it. Git add.git ignore. What this will do will be, we'll be adding the git ignore file as a tracked file in our current repository, and it will essentially get the files, or select the files that I'm about to stage for a commit. So I have added that. And once again, I'll use Git Status. And now highlights the fact that we've created a new file that's ready to be committed called git ignore. And we also have a change that has not been staged, but has identified, is already tracked. Now, just like we added a new file, we'll also add this modified file. So re and then tab and pulls in the whole file name. And I am supposed to add this, so that's where I missed the flag. And if I do git status one more time, we should see both files with the modifications and the new files ready and staged to be committed. Awesome. We have changes to be committed, git ignore, and the readme. Now, let's commit this. And if you have been paying attention, it will be really easy. Git commit. That's it. Now, you can do a git commit and it'll be fine. But the message, this prompted me to create a message for the commit, which, let's go back to our Git repository. If we go back to Git Basics, you see this initial commit description. That's the message that was associated to that commit. I will now create a message for the commit I'm making, which should be descriptive, should be short, sweet and simple. And for good Git etiquette, write a message that will be clear to anyone, not only other developers, but yourself. 5 years from now, you'll be reading this message and realize that's what I wanted to do. That's the point of Git messages, to act as a description for intention of that commit. So I will simply explain and describe what I did on this commit. Add git ignore. Add git ignore and update readme. Really simple, really clear. And these are commands that we shouldn't use, and I'll show you why in the next commit. This WQ stands for save and quit. Great. So I've created a commit message. This has been committed. And if I do a new git status, my branch is ahead of origin master by one commit. Now, what does that mean? Now, if we go back to your Bible, this means that my local repository is ahead of the master or the origin master. Now, origin master means two things. Origin, that it's the foreign or remote repository, the one that's up on GitHub. It calls itself the origin. And master is the branch that you've committed on or are tracking. So if we follow the flow of what steps we took, we made some modifications, we git added them. Once they were ready and for stage, which was when we had them highlighted as green, we committed them, and now they're sitting at our local repository. That's all the steps we've done so far. The local repository is now ahead of commit than the remote repository, which is saying I have more stuff or more changes than there was or currently is in the remote repository. And that's fine, and that's true. That's very accurate. We have not actually pushed these changes up to the server. The server, all it knows is, if we look at its commits, has only been committed once. And it was done from the side of GitHub. What's left for us to do in order for us to get those commits as part of the history on the remote repository is to push them up. Now, let's do this. Git Log. This is a new command. Git Log will give you a list of all the commits that we have. And I'll do a list of the last 5. The last 5 commits. I didn't even get to 5 because currently on my local repository, I only have 2. I have the initial commit, which I pulled down from the code up there, or up on the GitHub repository. And then I have the add, git, ignore, and update Readme commit. And this is the hash. This is the really long numerical cryptographic number that is associated to that commit. Each commit will have its own hash. It's not important for now. Who the author was and when the date was of the commit, as well as the commit message. Okay. So now I will git push my Git history in this repository, in this specific branch, up to the remote repository. Now it's asking me for an identification or authentication of my username to be able to commit into this repository. That's easy since I am the owner of that. Now it's counting objects, delta compression, doing all the steps and processes to push up the changes that I did from this commit hash to this commit hash. Meaning that this is the commit hash that was latest on the master up on GitHub, and I'm updating it to now be and contain the commit that I just added. If I had committed more than a single commit, it would put all those changes in there too. So now if we do a Git Status, my branch is up to date with what is located on GitHub master's branch. I have nothing to commit, and I'm working off of a clean tree. Means I don't have any changes right now. If I look up here, all these are white now. Everything is up to date with and synced up with what's online. Now, if I refresh this, I will see that Professor Jimes and committed 8 minutes ago and has that commit message. This commit message had these changes, which I added a git ignore file with the idea directory, and I created 3 lines of code. I've added 3 lines of code to the README, and this is on the 8826 BCA hash. This hash may look shorter than the one that we saw on the log, but this is just a short abbreviation of that hash. It's the same one. Now going back to Git Basics, if I look at the README that shows up, I will now see the new content that I added in locally. It will also show the Git message or the Git commit message associated to each file that was changed. So the license still kept the initial commit because I didn't make any modifications, and that's the last commit that it has, while the git ignore and the readme have now updated and contain the last git message associated with the commits on those files. It'll update time, and I will look at the branch, and master has been updated. Great. So for now, I think that's enough. We've covered a lot, and if you have any more questions, feel free to look at this. It's online. Just it's a slide that contains most of the information and the steps we did today. So if anything, we'll be using this flow across different projects, and we'll encounter different types of problems that we didn't highlight in this simple example, like what happens in a Git conflict, what is a branch, how do I merge, and what is a tracking branch. So for now, just go over and practice these steps. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time.